Von Mercer slapped the paper down on the table so hard that the oil lamp rattled. "Sign it," he said, "or by next week you'll be sleeping under a pine tree with that ugly mule of yours." Maren Whitlock stared at the number written on that paper. $40. That was what Von Mercer believed her father's land was worth. That was what he believed she was worth, a girl too heavy, too stubborn, too stupid to know when she was beaten. She was 18 years old. She had just buried her father 3 days ago. And this man, this well-fed man in his clean coat, was standing in the middle of her grief like he owned it. She didn't sign, and that decision, that one quiet, trembling refusal, would change everything. If that were you, sitting at that table, $40 between you and nothing, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that quiet people sometimes carry the most extraordinary secrets, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I don't want you to miss a single chapter of what's coming. And drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit the like button too, it tells me this kind of storytelling matters to you. Now, let's go back to Briar Hollow. The morning they read Orson Whitlock's will, the ground was still half frozen, and the trees hadn't decided yet whether autumn was over or winter had arrived early. That kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays there, the kind that makes old men walk slower, and young men impatient. Most of its windows were dark. Maren sat in the back of Alderman Cutter's front room on a wooden chair that creaked every time she shifted her weight. She was aware of the chair. She was always aware of chairs, whether they had arms that would bite into her hips, whether the legs looked sturdy enough, whether the people around her were noticing her. Windows were dark. It was an exhausting kind of awareness, the sort that becomes second nature when you've spent your whole life being the largest person in any room and learning to read the calculations in other people's eyes before they said anything out loud. Her half-brothers, Dale and Ferris, stood near the window. They hadn't offered her a seat. They hadn't spoken to her since she arrived. Dale had a way of looking at her that was almost a smirk, but not quite. He'd learned years ago that their father didn't tolerate open cruelty, so he'd refined it into something he could always deny. A glance that lasted half a second too long. A small exhale through the nose. Nothing you could name. Everything you could feel. Alderman Cutter read the will in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had done this many times and long since stopped feeling the weight of what he was delivering. The cabin and its contents. The livestock, 2 horses, 4 pigs, 11 chickens. The wagon. The tools in the barn, itemized down to a single awl and a rusted folding saw. 40 acres of tillable land running east along Briar Creek. All of it to Dale and Ferris, jointly and equally. Maren kept her hands folded in her lap and her face still. She had not expected much. Her mother had died when Maren was 4, and she had always understood, in the wordless way children understand things before they have language for them, that she occupied a different category in her father's house than Dale and Ferris did. Not unloved. She did not think unloved, but different, set slightly apart. Like a book kept on a separate shelf, valued perhaps, but not placed where the family's main library lived. Then Cutter read the second portion of the will. To my daughter, Maren Ruth Whitlock, I leave the following: 1 gray mule, name of Bramble, aged approximately 9 years. And the deed and full title to the property known locally as Whispering Falls, comprising the waterfall itself and the surrounding terrain, approximately 31 acres of cliff face, rock shelf, and wooded slope. The room went quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of solemnity, but the quiet of people deciding how quickly they were allowed to laugh. Dale got there first. It wasn't a loud laugh, it was worse than that. It was the laugh of a man who has been proven right about something he always suspected, low and satisfied, pushed out through his nose. Ferris pressed his mouth together and looked at the floor, which was his version of the same thing. Alderman Cutter cleared his throat and continued reading. Something about the deed being registered at the county seat. Something about the mule being currently stabled at the Whitlock property and available friction. Maren heard it all from a great distance. 31 acres of cliff face. A waterfall. 100-foot wall of water and useless wet rock and soil that would grow nothing but moss and misery. She had no house, no food stores, no tools, no animals, no land she could plant. She had a mule and a waterfall. A mule and a waterfall. She kept her hands folded. She kept her face still. She had learned that particular stillness over 18 years, and she was very good at it. It was the stillness of a person who has discovered that showing pain in front of certain people only gives them more of what they came for. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. The walk from Alderman Cutter's back to the edge of town took about 12 minutes. Maren made it in 15 because the ground was uneven and her boots had a split along the left heel that let the wet in. She was thinking about her father's face, not the face from the last months, when the illness had whittled him down to something barely recognizable, but his face from when she was perhaps 10 years old, and he had taken her to see Whispering Falls for the first and only time. She remembered the sound of it before she saw it, a low, constant thunder that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Then the trees opened, and there it was 100 feet of white water, dropping straight down into a pool of dark green, the mist rising from the impact point like something alive. She had stood at the edge of the clearing and felt very small and very large at the same time, which made no sense, and was still exactly what she felt. "Why does it whisper?" she had asked. Because everyone called it Whispering Falls, and all she could hear was a roar. Her father had been quiet for a moment. He was often quiet before he said things that mattered. "Come back when you know how to listen," he'd said, which was the kind of answer that drove her absolutely crazy when she was 10, and that she was only beginning to understand now at 18, walking through mud with a split-heeled boot and nothing to her name. She had not been back to the falls since that day. She wondered, with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, whether that had been a failure. Von Mercer found her at the edge of the Whitlock property before she even made it to the gate. He was a tall man, Mercer, with the particular confidence of someone who had been right about that just thing in his life to stop questioning whether he might someday be wrong. He wore a clean coat, which was how Maren always noticed him. He was a man whose coat was clean, regardless of weather or occasion, which told you something about how he moved through the world. He moved through it without getting dirty. "Miss Whitlock," he said it pleasantly. He was always pleasant, which made it harder. "Mr. Mercer, I heard about your father's passing. I'm sorry for it." She waited, because there was always a but with Von Mercer, and the but always arrived quickly. He wasn't a man who liked to waste time on the decorative parts of a conversation. "I wanted to speak with you before you made any decisions about the property," he said. "The Falls property. I understand that's what Orson left you." "Yes, I've had my eye on that acreage for some time. For timber operations, primarily the slopes above the falls have some mature stands that would be worth harvesting. The falls itself is a nuisance commercially, but the surrounding land has value, if you know what you're looking for." He paused. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer." He handed her the paper. She looked at it. $40. Something happened in her chest that she couldn't name immediately. It wasn't quite anger. It was closer to the feeling of being handed something with your name on it and discovering it's someone else's assessment of what you are. $40. For 31 acres of mountain land, for a waterfall that had stood for 10,000 years before either of them was born. For the last thing her father had chosen to leave her. "That's not fair," she said. Mercer blinked. He had not expected that. Most people, when offered anything at all, were grateful. "I assure you it reflects." "It reflects what you think I'll accept," Maren said, which is different. His expression shifted not to anger, not exactly, but to something adjacent. The look of a man recalibrating. "Miss Whitlock, I don't think you've considered your situation clearly. You have no home now, no means of income. The Falls property is terrain that would challenge able-bodied men with full equipment. He paused, and in that pause, she heard everything he chose not to say. He glanced at her once, briefly, and then at some neutral point above her shoulder. "You'd be in a difficult position attempting to make use of it." "Then I'll be in a difficult position," Maren said. She handed the paper back to him. He stared at it in her hand for a moment. "The offer expires," he said. "I won't hold it open indefinitely. I understand." She walked through the gate. Behind her, she heard him exhale through his nose, not quite a scoff, not quite a laugh, but something that lived exactly in the middle. Most of its windows were dark, the sound of a man who had decided the matter was already settled, regardless of what she thought about it. She hated that sound. She tucked that hatred somewhere small and quiet inside her chest, where it could do no harm and waste no energy, where it could simply sit and wait, the way useful things wait. Getting Bramble from the stable was its own particular experience. The mule was gray in the way old things are gray, not uniformly, but in patches, with darker streaks through his coat and a white patch above his left eye that gave him a permanent, skeptical expression. He was not young, and he was not fast. And when Maren led him out of the stall, he stopped immediately, planted all 4 feet, and looked at her with the specific resignation of an animal who had seen too much to be surprised by anything, but still found most things deeply inconvenient. "I know," Maren told him. Bramble flicked one ear. Dale was standing at the barn door. She hadn't heard him come up. "You actually going up there?" He said, "Yes." He laughed once, short. "You'll be back by nightfall, Maren. Terrain up there will eat you alive." "You're not exactly." He stopped, looked her over with that calibrated assessment she had spent 18 years learning to absorb without flinching. "You're not built for that kind of work." "I'm built exactly like I'm built," she said. Same as always. She didn't look at him when she said it. She gathered Bramble's lead rope and started toward the road. "The offer from Mercer is real money," Dale called after her. "Don't be stupid." She kept walking. She had been called stupid before. She had also been called lazy and slow and a burden, and various things that were less polite than those. She had learned that people said those things mostly when they needed you to do something that served them. And the moment you stopped doing it, they found new words. She camped the first night at the base of the ridge, in the hollow of a fallen hemlock large enough to shelter 2 people. She had taken a blanket and a half loaf of bread from the Whitlock kitchen, her kitchen. She supposed technically, except that Dale and Ferris's technically trumped hers in every way that mattered in Briar Hollow. She had taken what she could carry without making herself a thief. Bramble stood tied to a birch nearby and seemed unbothered by the darkness. Mules, she had heard somewhere, were harder to spook than horses. She was beginning to appreciate this quality more than she had anticipated. The cold came down hard after dark. She lay in the hemlock hollow, with the blanket pulled to her chin and listened to the woods, and thought about her father. Not his last days. She'd had enough of that during the weeks of sitting beside his bed, watching the labored breathing, learning the particular grief of losing someone slowly, in installments. Each day, a smaller version of the man you knew. She thought instead about the version of him from years ago. The one who walked quickly and always seemed to be thinking about 2 things at once, and had shelves of worn books that he never discussed, but always seemed to be in the middle of. He had not been a warm man, in the obvious sense. He didn't hug easily or say things directly when he could say them sideways. But there had been a quality to his attention when he gave it to you, a focused, serious quality that felt like being genuinely seen. He'd had that look when he'd taken her to the falls when she was 10, standing there beside her, watching her face instead of the water. "Come back when you know how to listen." She had thought it was a riddle, one of his annoying, impossible riddles. Now lying in the cold, she wondered if it was directions. The trail to Whispering Falls took 4 hours at Bramble's pace, which was neither fast nor negotiable. The terrain was exactly what Dale had described, and she hated him a little for being right about that one specific thing. The path rose steeply through 2 switchbacks and then disappeared into nothing, leaving her to navigate by instinct and the sound of water growing slowly louder. The slope was covered in wet leaves over hidden rocks, and she fell twice, once onto her hands, once hard onto her right knee, and each time she lay still for a moment and simply breathed, because she had learned that rushing through pain made it worse, and wading through it gave you information. Her knee throbbed. She categorized the throb muscular, not bone. She got up. Bramble watched her both times with that skeptical white-patched eye and offered no commentary. The trail narrowed near the top to a ledge barely wide enough for the mule, with a drop to the left that she did not look at directly. She kept one hand on the cliff face and talked to Bramble in a low, steady voice, not because she thought it helped him, but because it helped her. The sound of her own voice, calm and methodical, was its own kind of anchor. Then the trees opened, and there was the waterfall. 100 feet of pure, roaring white, dropping from an overhanging ledge into a pool of dark water below. The mist reached her instantly, cold on her face and hands. The sound was enormous. Not a sound you heard so much as one you were inside. She stood at the edge of the clearing and felt, exactly as she had at 10 years old, simultaneously very small and very large. She had been given this. Just this. A roar and a mist and 60 feet of slick, unworkable cliff on either side. She stood there for a long time. Bramble, behind her, walked to a particular spot near the waterfall's edge, a flat shelf of rock she hadn't noticed, and stopped. He put his nose down and breathed in. Then he looked up. His gaze went to the falls itself, specifically to one section of it, slightly left of center, where the water caught a different light. "What?" Maren said. Bramble did not answer because he was a mule, but he did not look away from that spot. She wiped the mist from her face and looked where he was looking. And something in the back of her skull, some old instinct that she had inherited from a reclusive, book-reading, quietly extraordinary father, went very still and very awake. The best stories her father had told her once, when she was perhaps 12, and asking why he hid his good tools in a false wall of the barn, are the ones people fail to recognize. She did not know yet what she was looking at, but she was beginning to suspect she was looking at a door. She stood in the mist for a long time, staring at that spot. The waterfall didn't change. It kept doing what it had always done, falling, roaring, filling the air with cold white noise that you stopped hearing after a while because your brain decided it was just the sound of the world now. The pool at the base churned and foamed and sent ripples out toward the dark edges where the moss began. The cliff faces on either side rose sheer and wet and indifferent. But Bramble kept looking at that section. Left of center, where the water fell at a slightly different angle than the rest, not dramatically different, not the kind of thing you'd notice if you were just passing through. The kind of thing you'd only see if you stood still long enough to notice that one part of the curtains was thicker than the others, that the white wasn't uniform, that there was, beneath the roar, if you listened at the right frequency, a hollow quality to the sound, like knocking on a wall and finding empty space behind it instead of solid wood. Maren had grown up in a house where her father knocked on walls. She looked at the cliff face to the left of the main curtain. Then she looked at the ledge system running along it, not a trail, nothing so deliberate as a trail, but a series of rock shelves that a person might, theoretically, use as footholds if they were careful, if they didn't mind the water, if they weren't in a hurry and had thought seriously about where they were putting each foot before they put it there. The drop to the pool was 60 feet. She turned around, walked back to where Bramble stood, and sat down on a dryish boulder. Then she pulled her bread from her pack, broke off a piece, and ate it slowly, because you don't make decisions about 60-foot drops on an empty stomach, and she had not eaten since the previous evening. Bramble watched her eat with profound indifference. "I'm not going today," she told him. "I need rope." He flicked an ear. "And I need to think about it," she added, which was honest. She was not going to pretend she wasn't frightened. Fear was information. The question was what you did with the information. She spent the rest of that first afternoon making a camp that was less an act of homesteading and more an act of problem-solving. The mist from the falls soaked everything within 30 feet of the pool. So she found a spot among the hemlocks slightly uphill and to the right far enough that the constant wet didn't reach, close enough that she could hear the water and use it as a kind of compass in the dark. She cut, and windows were dark. She cut hemlock boughs with her belt knife and layered them into something that was technically a bed, if you were generous with the definition. She built a fire using the driest wood she could find, which was not very dry, and spent 20 minutes nursing a flame that kept threatening to go out before it finally caught and stayed caught. It was not comfortable. Nothing about it was comfortable. She had expected that. She had not expected quite so immediately the specific loneliness of a place where no one knew where you were. Not the aloneness, she was comfortable with aloneness. She had spent most of her childhood that way. But the particular knowledge that if something went wrong here, there was no one to tell. If she slipped on those wet rocks and went into the pool, Bramble would stand there with his skeptical expression and eventually wander somewhere looking for better grass, and that would be the end of Maren Whitlock. She ate the rest of her bread and drank from the creek upstream of the falls where the water was clear, and she lay in her hemlock bed with the fire burning low beside her. And she thought about her father. She thought about the false wall in the barn. He'd built it when she was 8, and she'd found it by accident at age 12. While looking for a misplaced hammer, pressed the button, and the whole panel swung inward, revealing a shelf of tools, so well maintained they looked brand new. She'd never told Dale or Ferris. She didn't know why exactly, except that something in her understood it was meant to be her discovery, and not theirs. She thought about his books, He had books on subjects that made no sense for a mountain trapper: geology, botany, entomology, cartography. Books with Latin words in them. Books with hand-drawn illustrations of insects and plants that he had amended in his own cramped handwriting, corrections, additions, observations of his own. She had not been allowed to touch those books as a child, not because he forbade it, but because he simply watched her when she moved near them with a quality of attention that communicated something without words. Those books had not been in the will. She had noticed that. She had noticed it at Alderman Cutter's and filed it in that same small place inside her chest where she kept useful things. The cabin and its contents to Dale and Ferris. But she had catalogued the visible books in her mind and compared the list against everything she had seen in her father's room, in her father's house, and the mathematics didn't work. There were books she had seen him reading that were not on any shelf she could find. She stared at the fire. The best doors are the ones people fail to recognize. She closed her eyes. 3 days into her camp, a woman named Berta Suggs came up the trail. Maren heard her before she saw her the crunch of boots on the switchback, and a particular muttered commentary directed at the terrain that Maren recognized as the voice of someone who climbed hills out of duty rather than preference. Berta Suggs was 62 years old, had run the trading post at Briar Hollow for 30 years, and had known Maren's father since before Maren was born. She was a short-looked, dense woman with forearms that looked like braided rope, and the directness of someone who had processed too many transactions over too many decades to have patience for indirection. She arrived in the clearing with a cloth sack in one hand and the expression of a woman who had decided something and acted on it before she could talk herself out of it. "You're alive," she said, looking Maren over. "Yes." "Good. I brought things." She set the sack down and began removing its contents with the brisk efficiency of someone restocking a shelf. Salt pork, a paper of matches, a coil of rope-heavy hemp, maybe 40 feet, candles, a turnip, which Maren considered the most practical and least glamorous gift she had ever received, a jar of rendered lard, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a knife, longer than her belt knife, a hunting knife, well used, with a handle worn smooth from years of the same grip. "That was your father's," Berta said, watching her unwrap it. "He left it at the store to be sharpened 2 months before he died and never came back for it. I figured." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I figured it should come to you." Maren turned the knife over in her hands. The blade caught the pale light. She knew this knife. She had watched her father use it 100 times. The handle fit her palm like it had been made for a hand just slightly larger than hers. "Thank you," Maren said. Berta waved it off in the manner of a person who was not comfortable with gratitude and had arranged her life to minimize its occurrence. "How long are you planning to stay up here?" "I don't know yet. Dale's telling everyone you'll come down inside a week." "That sounds like Dale. Mercer came into the store yesterday. He's raised his offer to $60. Berta's eyes stayed steady on her face. Not pushing, not pulling, just delivering information the way she delivered everything. He said it was final. "It's not final," Maren said. "He'll raise it again." Berta was quiet for a moment. "You know something about this place that you're not saying." "I'm not sure yet." Maren looked at the rope coiled at her feet, then at the waterfall, visible through the trees from this angle, just the top section of it, where the water came over the lip and began its fall, white and straight and constant. "I have a feeling your father had feelings," Berta said. "He was right about them more often than not, and wrong about them just enough times to keep him humble." She picked up her empty sack and shook the debris from the bottom. "He loved you, you know, in his way," which was a complicated way. Maren didn't answer. "He talked about you differently than he talked about those boys," Berta continued. "I don't know if you knew that. He talked about Dale and Ferris the way a man talks about a problem he's already solved. He talked about you the way a man talks about something he's still working on, like you were unfinished business. In a good way, I mean." She hesitated. "The good kind of unfinished." Maren stared at the rope. "I need to get back down before dark," Berta said. "Nee doesn't do the return trip in bad light anymore." She started toward the trailhead. Then she paused without turning. "If you go behind that waterfall and find something, try not to fall off anything first. There are enough dead Whitlocks for 1 year." She left. Maren sat with the rope in her hands for a long time. She waited until morning to try. Not because morning was safer, exactly, but because she wanted full light, and she wanted to have slept on it, and she wanted to stop stensis and either do it or decide not to do it. And lying in the hemlock bed the night before, she had worked through every reason not to and found them all insufficient against one central fact. Her father had left her this place deliberately. Orson Whitlock was not a careless man. He was not a sentimental man. If this was what he had chosen to give her, there was a reason. She needed to know the reason. She tied one end of the rope to the largest cedar she could find, at the edge of the clearing. A tree whose roots went so deep into the mountain that it seemed less planted than grown from the mountain's own bones. She tested the knot 3 times. She tied the other end around her waist with a bowline because the bowline won't slip and won't tighten under load, and was the only knot her father had ever taught her with any urgency. If you're ever in a situation, he'd said, holding her small hands and guiding them through the loops where a knot failing means you die, you use a bowline. Do you hear me? She had been 11. She'd nodded seriously. Show me again, he'd said. She'd tied it again. Again. She'd tied it 5 times that afternoon until her fingers knew it without her brain needing to supervise. She tied it now, checked it, and looked at Bramble. He was eating grass at the edge of the clearing with a philosophical detachment from events. I'll be back, she said. She started toward the ledge. The first 10 feet were the worst. Not because they were the most dangerous, the ledge there was actually wide enough to stand on with both feet, but because they were the longest 10 feet she had ever covered. The mist hit her face immediately, cold and total, and the sound of the falls went from loud to something beyond loud, something that occupied the inside of her skull and pushed out the ability to think in words. She could only operate in instinct and muscle memory. She kept one hand flat against the cliff face. The rock was cold and slightly rough, and she was grateful for the roughness. The ledge narrowed. She tested each foothold before she committed weight to it, slowly, the way her father had taught her to test ice gradually, so that if it gave way, you still had 1 foot on solid ground. Her knee from the earlier fall ached steadily. She didn't have the bandwidth to care about it. The rope was tight at her waist. That was good. That meant she hadn't gone farther than the slack allowed, which meant she was still within the cedar's reach. She moved left. Now, she could the force of it as pressure, rather than just sound. The air itself pushed and churned by 100 feet of falling weight. The mist was no longer mist but actual water, soaking her hair and running down her neck and into her collar. Her hands were wet. She pressed them harder against the rock to compensate. There was a moment, just a moment, where the ledge disappeared. She stopped, looked down at her feet, at the rock beneath them, at the place where the rock she was standing on ended, and there was nothing for about 2 feet before the ledge resumed on the other side. 2 feet of nothing, with a 60-foot drop below it, and the rope at her waist and the cedar behind her, and her own body weight between her and the pool. She understood in that moment exactly what her father meant by people failing to recognize a door. Anyone looking at this from the outside would see a woman too heavy for such a crossing, would see the gap and the drop and the wet rock and make the calculation that it wasn't worth doing, would see the math and decide the math said no. Maren looked at the gap and thought, 2 feet. I know what 2 feet is. I know what this body can do. She reached both hands as far as they would go along the cliff face to the right, finding a grip lip in the rock, thin but real. She shifted her weight forward. She felt the rope at her waist, pull taut not because she was falling, but because she was leaning, trusting the cedar and the bowline and the rope her father had taught her to trust. She stepped, 1 foot on the far ledge, then the other, and on the side of the gap, the ledge widened again, and the curtain of water was directly beside her. Now she could reach out and touch it, and in front of her, barely visible through the white and the noise and the cold, was a darkness that wasn't rock, a recess, a shadow with depth to it, an opening in the cliff face roughly the height and width of a narrow doorway, half hidden by the angle of the waterfall's curtain. Her father's door. Her heart was doing something complicated. She stood absolutely still for a count of 5, breathing, checking her feet, checking her grip, and then she moved into the opening. The sound changed instantly. It didn't stop. The falls roared on the other side of the curtain, and the stone conducted it in every direction, but it changed quality. It became the sound of something outside rather than something surrounding her. The air was cold and very damp, but still not moving. The kind of stillness that means shelter. She was in a tunnel, low-ceilinged, perhaps 7 feet at the highest point, carved partly by water, and partly she could see the tool marks in the stone even in the poor light from the falls behind her by something else, by someone else. The floor was rough but level, or nearly level, and the ground beneath her feet was not wet rock, but packed earth. Someone had laid a floor in here. Someone had smoothed the walls. She stood in the dark with the roar behind her and let her eyes adjust, and slowly the tunnel resolved itself into something she could navigate. Most of its windows were dark. It went straight back perhaps 20 feet and then curved left, and around that curve was a faint orangish glow that she couldn't account for until she followed it and found its source. A chimney fissure in the rock, narrow, probably invisible from the outside, running up through the mountain to some opening she couldn't see. And coming down through it, the last of the afternoon light, thin and gold and filtered by distance, falling on a wooden door. An actual door, hinged, with iron hardware that had rusted to a deep brown and a latch that was the old bar drop kind, simple and heavy. She stood in front of it. She put her hand on the latch. She lifted it. The smell hit her first. Beeswax, old paper, dried herbs of some kind she couldn't name them immediately, something green and resinous. And underneath all of it, so faint she might have imagined it, the smell of her father's coat. That particular combination of tobacco smoke and pine resin and something else, something she had never been able to identify, that she associated so completely with him that smelling it now, here, in the dark of a mountain she had never expected to enter, made her stop walking and stand very still and breathe it in before it could leave. She had thought she was done crying. She had cried at his bedside during the 3 weeks of the worst of it, and she had cried the morning he died. And she had cried once more privately the night before the will reading. She had told herself she was done. She was not done. She stood in the doorway of her father's hidden room and cried for about 2 minutes. And it was not a graceful cry. It was the ugly, compressed kind that happens when you've been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and something makes you loosen your grip all at once. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, which was wet anyway from the falls, and she stepped inside. The room was larger than the tunnel had suggested, perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to 10 feet at the center where the chimney fissure began. Along the walls, rough-hewn shelves. On the shelves, books, dozens of them, some that she recognized from her father's house and more that she didn't. Journals, she realized as she moved closer, examining the spines. Not published books. Hand-bound journals, dozens of them, arranged by year. The earliest she could find had a date scratched on the spine that placed it 23 years ago. She would have been barely a year old. He had been coming here for 23 years. She pulled one of the journals from the shelf middle of the sequence, perhaps 10 years ago, and opened it carefully. The pages were dense with her father's cramped handwriting, but interspersed among the text were drawings. Detailed, precise, beautiful drawings of plants and insects and rock formations, with measurements and annotations and cross-references to other journal numbers. On the opposite page from a drawing of a beetle she couldn't name, he had written, "The ridge above the falls contains at minimum 6 distinct mineral strata not documented in Harwick's 1863 survey. Will attempt mapping in autumn when the light holds longer on the north face." She turned pages, found a map. Several maps, actually hand-drawn, meticulous, covering the entire valley below Whispering Falls and the ridgeline above it. She recognized landmarks she knew, the creek, the old Miller place, the road to the county seat. But there were features on these maps she had never seen anywhere else. Underground water sources marked with dotted blue lines. Mineral deposits marked with small symbols she'd have to decode. A note in the margin of one, limestone formation consistent with cave systems, further north possible access via the Falls Cavern, unexplored. He had mapped everything. For 23 years, alone, he had come to this place and documented the valley as if it were his private territory, as if he were building something. She kept moving through the room. In one corner, seeds, stored in labeled paper packets, organized on a shelf with the same precision as the journals. Native plants. She realized the labels were in her father's hand, with growing notes and harvest dates. Years of seed saving. A fortune in future gardens, if you knew what you had. In another corner, geological specimens. Rocks she couldn't name, arranged on a cloth and labeled in the same cramped script. Some of them were tagged with location markers that corresponded to the maps on the shelves. In the center of the room, on a work table, because there was a work table, a simple one, made from mountain boards and rough-cut legs, but level and solid, a lantern, a tin of matches, several candles in various stages of use, and a stack of papers held down by a rock. On top of the stack, a letter. It was addressed in her father's handwriting. For Maren. She sat down on the only chair in the room, low, three-legged, the kind you make when you have time and no pretensions, and she held the letter in both hands for a moment without opening it. Outside, through the mountain and the rock and the curtain of falling water, the world was continuing without her. Dale was probably at the Whitlock house right now, inventorying what he'd inherited. Mercer was probably at the trading post, calculating when she'd come back down the mountain. The town was probably already reassigning her to the category of sad stories, the heavy girl who tried to live on a waterfall and came home in a week. She opened the letter. Her father's handwriting was difficult at the best of times. He pressed too hard, and his letters leaned at inconsistent angles, as though he were always in a slight hurry, even when he had nowhere to be. She had spent years learning to read it. Maren, it began. Just that, no greeting attached, because he was never a man for preamble. If you found this, you did what I expected you to do. You stood still long enough to look, and you looked long enough to see, and you were brave enough to cross over. I want you to understand something first. The waterfall was never the inheritance. I know people will have laughed. Let them. They measured it by what it appeared to be worth, which is the same thing they've always done with you, and they've always been wrong about that too. What I've left you is everything in this room. 23 years of work. Maps of this valley that do not exist anywhere else. Journals documenting natural history that no one else has thought to record. Seed collections from native plants that the commercial farmers are slowly driving out of existence. Mineral surveys, water surveys, observations that some men in some cities would pay serious money to own if they knew they existed. They don't know. I kept this place because I knew what happened to things that men like Von Mercer's discover. They get bought and sold and used up, and the thing that made them extraordinary gets plowed under. But I also kept it because I needed it to be a test. I'm sorry for that. I know it isn't fair. But I spent 30 years watching your brothers take everything they were given and use it badly, and I needed to know that what I left you would go to someone who would look after it the way it deserves. Someone who wouldn't sell it when things got hard. Someone who would stand in front of a waterfall in October with nothing but a mule and a rope and decide that the thing most people would call worthless was worth the trouble of finding out. That is you. It was always you. I don't say it often enough. I haven't said it nearly enough. But you have a quality that I have watched in you since you were very small, and I am going to name it plainly here, since I apparently cannot manage to say it directly to your face in any conversation we have ever had. You are patient, not passive patient. You endure things that would make other people cut and run, and you do it while still paying attention, and that is a rarer thing than you know. The room is yours. The work is yours. I am leaving you a starting place, not a finished thing. Whether it becomes something is up to you. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how to tell you the right things. Your father, P.S. The geological survey on the third shelf contains information about a quartz vein running through the north face that the county assessor has never documented. Do not mention it to Mercer under any circumstances. She sat with the letter in her hands until the light through the chimney fissure went from gold to gray, which meant the afternoon was nearly gone, and she needed to get back across the ledge before the dark made it genuinely impossible. She moved through the room one more time, touching things carefully, the spines of the journals, the edges of the maps, the labeled seed packets, each one representing a plant someone had thought worth preserving. She found on the bottom shelf behind a row of journals a tin box. Inside the tin, money. Not a fortune, $22 in coin, and a few smaller bills, but real money, and it was the first money she had possessed in 3 days. She counted it twice, put it back in the tin, put the tin in her coat pocket. She took 2 candles and the tin of matches and the letter. She latched the door behind her. She crossed the ledge back in the dying light, moving slowly, not rushing, testing each foothold. Her knee ached. The rope held. She came around the last section of wet cliff and stepped back into the clearing and stood there for a moment with the sound of the falls filling the air around her. Bramble was exactly where she'd left him. Found it, she told him. He did not seem surprised. She built up the fire and sat beside it and ate at the last of the salt pork Berta had brought, and she looked at the waterfall in the last light, watching the way the curtain of water caught the orange of the sky behind her. That section left of center, the place where the water was thicker, where the angle changed, the door that looked like a waterfall. She thought about what her father had written, about patience, about the difference between enduring and paying attention. She had spent most of her life thinking those were different things, that endurance was just something you did with your body, the way you did it when someone said something about your size and you made your face stills and waited for it to be over. She had not understood until now that what she'd been doing was more than surviving the moment. She had been watching. She had been filing things away. She had been keeping a very long, very precise account of what people revealed about themselves when they thought she wasn't paying enough attention to notice. Her father had been doing the same thing. 23 years of watching. 23 years of recording what the valley was, underneath what people decided it was worth. She thought about Mercer's clean coat, and the way he'd looked at her on the day of the will, reading that quick upward glance, the assessment, and then the deliberate redirect to a neutral point above her shoulder. She thought about Dale's laugh, low and satisfied, the laugh of a man who has been confirmed in a belief he already held. Let them. She lay down in her hemlock bed with the fire crackling beside her and the falls roaring in the dark. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like someone waiting for permission to begin. She felt like someone who had already started. The cold came down from the mountain, and she pulled the blanket closer and listened to the water. And somewhere in the space between listening and sleeping, she found, for the first time since standing at her father's bedside, watching his breathing slow and stop, something that was not quite peace, but was the room next to it. The room that looks out toward peace from a distance and says, eventually, not yet, but eventually she slept. Above the hemlock boughs and the fire smoke and the cliff face, the stars came out one by one over Whispering Falls, cold and indifferent and entirely unimpressed by what had just happened in that hidden room behind the water. The mountain kept its own counsel the way it always had. But something in it had shifted in the way that things shift when someone finally shows up who was supposed to be there all along. The days that followed were not triumphant. That was the thing about finding something extraordinary. It didn't immediately make the ordinary problems go away. The morning after she found the room, Maren woke up with her left hip screaming from 3 nights on hemlock boughs, the fire reduced to cold ash, frost on the blanket, and Bramble standing 6 feet away, staring at her with the specific expression of an animal whose breakfast was overdue. She lay there for a moment, looking up at the pale gray sea sky through the hemlock branches, and took inventory. Her knee had stiffened overnight, and moving it produced a sensation like broken glass grinding in the joint. Her hands were chapped from the wet rock. She had 4 matches left from Berta's supply, a third of a candle, no food, and $22 in a tin box that was doing her no good at this elevation. She had also found the most important thing her father had ever owned, which was hidden behind a waterfall that most people in Briar Hollow didn't know contained anything but water. She sat up. Her hip made a sound like a floorboard. I know, she said, to no one in particular. She got up. Getting down the mountain took the better part of the morning, partly because of her knee, and partly because she took a different route on the way back, moving more slowly and deliberately through terrain she hadn't navigated before. She was already thinking in the language her father had apparently fluently, for 2 decades, the language of careful observation, of noting what was here before you decided what to do about it. She marked in her mind the places where the slope leveled briefly, where a person might build something flat. She noted a spring she hadn't seen on the way up, seeping from between 2 rocks and running clear and cold down the hillside. She noted the mature hemlocks and the younger birches coming in behind them, and the way the wind moved through the upper canopy from the northwest. She was not entirely sure what she was going to do with any of this, but she noted it because her father had spent 23 years noting things. She was beginning to understand that the noting was not separate from the doing. The noting was the first act of the doing. You had to see something clearly before you could decide what it was for. Bramble followed at his own pace, which was slow enough to be companionable and steady enough to be reliable. She went to Berta's first. because Berta was the only person in Briar Hollow she trusted with partial information. The trading post smelled of dried beans and leather and the particular sweetness of old wood that has absorbed years of smoke and wax. It was mid-morning, and the store was empty except for Berta herself, who was at the counter working through a ledger with the focused intensity of someone who has made arithmetic personal. She looked up when Maren came in. Her eyes did the quick assessment coat, boots, hands, face that Maren recognized from her own internal habit because she'd inherited it from her father. And apparently Berta Suggs had developed it independently over a lifetime of reading customers. "You look like you slept outside 3 nights, Berta said. "I did sleep outside 3 nights. And Maren set the tin box on the counter. "I need supplies, salt pork flour, oil, cornmeal. Another coil of rope if you have it, the hemp kind, not the braided. A second blanket, a hatchet." She paused. "A journal. The blank kind." Berta looked at the tin box, then at Maren. Then she went to the shelves without asking questions, which was one of the things Maren appreciated most about her. She pulled things down and stacked them on the counter and wrote in her ledger with the stub of a pencil. And when she was done, she turned the ledger around so Maren could see the total. $18.40. Maren counted out the coins and the bills from the tin, leaving herself $3.60. And she was aware that this was almost nothing, and that winter was coming, and that the room behind the waterfall, extraordinary as it was, had no stove and no food stores, and approximately zero infrastructure for actually living in. She was aware of all of this, and she paid the $18.40 anyway, because the alternative was coming down from the mountain permanently, and she was not doing that. "You found something," Berta said. It was not a question. "I found something. Good or bad?" "Good." Maren picked up the journal from the counter. It was simple cloth cover, unlined pages, the kind used for drawing or writing or both. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask my father." "Did he ever mention anything about the falls? Anything unusual about it?" Berta was quiet for long enough that Maren knew the answer was complicated. She finished entering the sale in her ledger, closed it, and looked up. "He didn't talk much about himself," she said finally. "You know that. But once, maybe 8-9 years ago, he came in here with mud on his boots and a look on his face that I'd never seen before. Like he was full of something he couldn't say out loud. He bought a set of drawing nibs, 6 of them, the fine ones. I asked him what he was working on, and he said," she paused, looked out the window, "something worth the trouble of finishing." She turned back to Maren. He looked happy. It was the only time in 30 years I could say that about him and mean it fully. Maren folded her receipt and put it in her coat pocket. "Does Dale know about any of this?" Berta asked. "No." "Does Mercer?" "No." Berta picked up her pencil and turned back to her ledger. "Then mind who you tell," she said. "And mind when." She was supplies onto Bramble in front of the trading post when she heard Dale's voice from across the road. He was coming out of the feed store with Ferris, and he saw her before she saw him. She knew this because of the quality of the pause, the slight adjustment in his trajectory that meant he had decided to come her way before she had a chance to be somewhere else. "You down," he said. He said it with a particular flatness that was its own form of satisfaction. "I needed supplies." "You're going back up." He said this the way you'd say you're going to do something pointless, with the emphasis adjusted just enough to make the stupidity implicit rather than explicit. He had always been precise about that kind of thing. "Yes." Ferris was looking at the supply bundles on Bramble's back. He was a quieter version of Dale, his edges softened slightly by nature, if not by any deliberate choice. "Maren, it's almost November," he said. "The terrain up there if there's early snow. I'll manage." "You'll manage," Dale repeated, and this time there was no flatness in it at all, just the naked version of what he usually kept calibrated. He stepped closer. "Listen, Mercer is done being patient. He told me himself. He's looking at other timber parcels up the ridge, and if he finds one that suits him better, his offer disappears." He lowered his voice, not out of consideration, but out of the calculation that lower voices carry more authority. "Take the $60, Maren. Take it and find a position in town, a household that needs help. You can't live on a cliff face." She looked at him. She had known Dale her whole life, and she had never loved him, and she had never hated him either. Not exactly, because hating him would have required thinking about him more than he deserved. What she felt looking at him now was something closer to pity which she knew he would have found more offensive than any other response she could have given him. "I'm not selling," she said. "Because of sentiment? Because, father, because I don't want to," she said. "That's enough of a reason." She picked up Bramble's lead rope. "You're making a mistake," Dale said to her back. "Then it's mine to make," she said. And she didn't say it loudly or with any particular drama, because the point wasn't to wound him. The point was simply that it was true, and true things don't require decoration. She walked away. Behind her, she heard Ferris say something to Dale in a low voice, and Dale make a dismissive sound. She didn't turn around. She started the second week at the falls with a different approach to almost everything. The hemlock bed was reconstructed with more thought, this time on a platform of split pines she laboriously cut and stacked to get herself off the ground, which reduced the morning hip situation from unbearable to merely uncomfortable. She got the fire architecture right on the second attempt, building a stone reflector at the back that pushed het forward instead of letting it dissipate into the open air. She found a small overhang in the cliff face to the right of the clearing, low and narrow, but enough to keep a fire dry in the rain if she built it at the right angle. These were not comfortable accommodations. Let that be clear. The mist from the falls reached her even at this distance when the wind shifted, which it did without warning and with apparent personal malice. The ground was never entirely dry. She slept in her coat. She woke up at least once every night to rebuild the fire. But she stopped waking up and immediately cataloging reasons why this was impossible, which was not nothing. During the days, she worked on two things simultaneously, improving the campsite enough to be survivable through the coming cold, and spending as much time as she could in her father's room. The crossing behind the falls became less terrifying with repetition, which was its own lesson. The first time she'd done it, every step had been a conversation with mortality. The second time, it had been frightening. The third time, she'd noticed things she hadn't seen before: a better handhold, 6 inches higher than the one she'd been using, a section of ledge that was actually wider than it looked from the approach. By the fifth crossing, she was still careful, always careful, but careful in the way of someone who knows the terrain, rather than in the way of someone who doesn't know what will happen next. Her body adapted in ways she hadn't anticipated, and in ways that were difficult to describe without sounding like the kind of story that wasn't true. She didn't become thin. Nothing about her changed in that direction, and she had never expected it to. What changed was more specific than that. Her hands grew stronger. Most of its windows were dark. The particular muscles in her legs that managed steep terrain learned their job and started doing it more efficiently. She found lines through the slope that cost her less energy, not because she was moving faster, but because she was moving smarter, using the terrain's own angles instead of fighting them, letting her body weight work with the incline instead of against it. She had always been strong. She had never been given much credit for it, partly because the way people imagine strength was different from the way it actually worked in a body like hers. She began reading her father's journals in order. The earliest ones from 23 years ago were rough. His drawing was still developing, and his observations were good, but uneven, detailed in some places, skipping things in others. She could see him learning what mattered, could see him deciding, over the course of several years, to be systematic about it. Around year 4, the journals changed quality entirely. Organized, precise, cross-referenced with a notation system he'd apparently invented himself. Each entry dated and located by a reference code that matched the maps. He had been, she realized slowly, a genuinely accomplished naturalist. Not in the formal credentialed sense. He had no university behind him, no letters after his name, no membership in any scientific society. He was a mountain trapper who had taught himself to see, who had developed, through pure stubbornness and available time, and some quality of attentions that she recognized because she had inherited it, a documentation of this valley that was both beautiful and scientifically serious in ways she was only beginning to appreciate. She read one entry at a time, with the journal open on her knees in the dim light of a candle, taking her time. She had brought the blank journal from Berta's, and she started adding her own observations in the back of it. Nothing as systematic as her father's yet, but the beginning of a practice. What she had seen that day, what the weather had done. Most of its windows were dark, where Bramble had stood and what he'd been looking at, because she had decided that the mule's attention was worth tracking as data. She found the geological survey on the third shelf. Her father's PS came back to her, "Do not mention it to Mercer under any circumstances." She read the survey carefully, pausing at technical terms and working out their meaning from context and from a reference book on her father's shelf. The quartz vein, he'd noted, ran through the north face of the ridge above the falls, with a notation in his handwriting, color and character consistent with mineralization patterns, gold-bearing quartz possible but not confirmed, would require assay. Below that, in different ink, as if added later, left this for Maren to decide, not mine to use up. She sat with that for a long time. Not mine to use up. He had known, or suspected, and he had deliberately not acted on it, not because it wasn't valuable, but because using it would have changed everything about this place, and he didn't think that was his decision to make. He had chosen to leave it intact, like the seeds, like the maps, like the journals themselves. He had been building an inheritance that was the opposite of what people in Briar Hollow understood an inheritance to be, not something to spend, but something to complete. She closed the survey and put it back on the third shelf. She was not going to make any decisions about quartz veins yet. She was not going to make decisions about anything yet. She was in the noting phase, and she was learned from her father's journals that the noting phase done well was where most of the important decisions actually got made quietly, under the surface, before you even knew you were deciding. On the 12th day, it rained, not the usual autumn drizzle that the mountain dispersed through the canopy and turned into a pleasant background pattern. This was a real rain, the kind that came in from the northwest and didn't have any interest in being polite about it. It arrived in the late morning with a wind that brought the temperature down 15 degrees in an hour and made the fire in her stone reflector something she had to defend actively, feeding it constantly, shielding it with her body when the gusts hit the overhang at bad angles. She was in the room behind the falls most of that day, reading and resting and eating cold cornbread she'd cooked the day before on a flat hearthstone. The room was remarkable in a rainstorm. The mountain swallowed the sound of the rain entirely. She could hear nothing but the constant bass line of the falls, which actually got louder, as the runoff increased the volume of water coming over the lip. But inside nothing changed. The temperature was cold but stable. The floor stayed dry. The candles burned without flickering. It was, she thought, the most protected shelter she had ever been inside. Not comfortable, exactly, but secure in a way that most buildings never achieved, because most buildings were fighting against the weather, and this one simply ignored it by virtue of being part of the mountain itself. She spent part of the afternoon drawing, not plants or rock formations, she would get to that, but the room itself. She made careful sketches of the shelf layout, the door placement, the chimney fissure and its angle. She measured distances with a knotted cord she'd made for the purpose. She was thinking about what the room needed to become actually livable through winter, which was different from what it currently was. A cache, a storage place, a study. It had not been designed for daily habitation. She needed a stove, or something that functioned like one. The chimney fissure ran up through the mountain narrow, but working because the candle flame bent toward it consistently. If she could connect a small stove to that fissure, she could heat the room. The problem was getting a stove up the cliff face and across the ledge, which presented obvious logistical difficulties. The problem before the problem was money, which she had $3.60 of. She was going to need to solve the money problem. She thought about this practically without the overlay of shame she'd sometimes felt about not having any, because shame required caring what certain people thought, and she had been progressively losing that particular vulnerability since the day she walked out of Alderman Cutter's front room with a waterfall and a mule. She thought, what do I have that someone will pay for? The seed collection. But selling that felt wrong. Those seeds were documentation, part of her father's work. And she wasn't ready to thin them yet. The geological information. Also wrong, and complicated in ways she didn't want to invite yet. Her own labor. She was at the falls. She was building things. She was learning what this terrain could do. She could cut timber selective cutting, the kind that didn't strip a hillside, but harvested what was mature. She had a hatchet, and she was getting stronger every day. Timber cut right could go down the mountain on Bramble's back in manageable loads and sell at the mill in Garrett's Crossing, 6 miles east. It was not a comfortable solution. It was a solution. She had been cutting timber for 4 days steady, careful, sustainable cutting on the upper slope above the falls, where the mature hemlocks were crowded enough that removing some of them would benefit the ones remaining, when she heard something that didn't belong to the mountain. She stopped, stood still, listened voices. Coming up the trail from below, at least 2 people. She set the hatchet handle against a tree and moved to where she could see the trailhead opening, staying inside the tree line. Old habit. The habit of a woman who had learned that finding out who was coming before they saw you was almost always worth the extra 20 seconds. It was Mercer. And with him, a man she didn't recognize, younger, with the look of someone who dealt in numbers rather than materials. A ledger man. He had clean hands. They came into the clearing, and Mercer stopped, hands on his hips, and looked at the waterfall. His expression was not appreciation. It was the expression of a man looking at an obstacle. "How's the timber up above?" the ledger man asked. "Quality stands," Mercer said. "Mature hemlock primarily, some hardwood mixed in. Access is the issue. You'd need to cut a road up the south face, which is a significant investment. But once it's in, the extraction costs come down, and the volume justifies it." He turned, scanning the clearing. "She's been here. Look." He was looking at her camp. The stone reflector, the wood stack, the cleared ground. "She's actually trying to establish here," the ledger man said, with the tone of someone encountering an animal that has done something unexpected. "I know." Mercer's voice was even, which means the $60 offer isn't going to move her. She's dug in. He walked toward the waterfall, stopped at the pool's edge, looked up at the cliff faces. "The question is whether we need her signature or whether there's another approach." Maren stood absolutely still in the tree line. "What kind of approach?" the ledger man asked. Mercer turned away from the falls. Her father left the property to her outright. County deed. That's solid. He paused. But she's 18 and unmarried and working alone on a mountain in November. If she gets into difficulty up here, if something happens, and she can't maintain the property, the land reverts to the estate, and the estate is Dale and Ferris Whitlock. He let that sit in the air between them. Dale and Ferris Whitlock are considerably more practical than their sister. The ledger man was quiet for a moment. "You're saying if she fails?" "I'm saying if she fails naturally," Mercer said, "our position improves considerably. I'm not saying anything beyond that." Maren's hand tightened around the hatchet handle she had just realized she was still holding. She had been angry before in her life. She had been furious, the slow-burning kind that she'd learned to contain and redirect. But this was different. This was the anger of hearing yourself discussed as a problem to be managed as an obstacle that could be removed if you simply waited for the mountain to do it. The cold administrative calm in Mercer's voice made it worse. He wasn't gleeful about it, wasn't cruel the way Dale was cruel. He was simply practical. She was a variable in a calculation, and he was discussing what happened to the equation if that variable resolved itself unfavorably. She stood in the trees for a very long time after they left. Long after their voices faded back down the switchback. She stood and breathed and made herself think clearly instead of reactively, because clarity was what she needed right now, not the hot rush of anger, which felt good and did nothing. Mercer wanted her to fail. Specifically, he wanted her to fail quietly. Without drama, without anyone to witness it, just a cold November on a mountain, and eventually a girl who came back down with nothing. And the land falling back to Dales and Ferris, who would sell it before winter was fully over. She needed to not fail. She also needed witnesses. The next morning, she went down to Briar Hollow specifically to see Berta Suggs. She didn't tell Berta what she'd overheard, not exactly, because she wasn't ready to use it yet, and telling it before she was ready would put Berta in a difficult position. What she did was ask Berta, as casually as she could manage, whether she knew the county property laws regarding land reversion. Berta looked at her sideways. "Why?" "Orsison left me that land outright. I want to know if there's anything that could undo that." Berta leaned on the counter and thought about it in the deliberate way she thought about most things. If you're alive and not declared incompetent, the deed stands. It's yours to keep or sell. She paused. "Unless you abandon it. There's an abandonment clause in most deeds up here. If you fail to actively maintain or use the property for a set period, it can revert. Usually 3 to 5 years, but I'd have to read your specific deed." "I'd like to read it," Maren said. "Do you have a copy somewhere?" "Father may have left one. He left a copy at the county seat. You'd need to ride to Garrett's Crossing to get the particulars. Maren thought about 6 miles and her knee and her money and what Mercer had said in that flat, practical voice. If she fails naturally. I'll go Saturday, she said. It's a long ride. It's a long ride, she agreed. Berta looked at her for a moment with that fast-reading expression. Maren, are you in trouble? Not yet, Maren said. I'm trying to make sure I don't get there. She bought another jar of lard and a sack of dried beans with the last of her money. She was flat broke now, except for what she could get from the next timber load, which, because hadn't been able to take down it because she'd been trying to cut enough to make the trip to Garrett's Crossing worth doing at the same time. She went out to where Bramble was tied and pressed her forehead against his neck for a moment, not for any particular reason, except that sometimes you needed something solid. He stood still for it. He was a good mule that way. The timber trip to Garrett's Crossing took 2 days, one down the mountain, and across to the mill, one back. The mill manager was a compact, red-faced man named Tolbert, who looked at her timber, and then at her, and then at the timber again, as if verifying that the same person had produced both, which she found irritating and chose not to address. He paid her $4.80 for the load, less than she'd hoped. She stood at his counter and negotiated quietly, methodically, citing the quality of the cuts and the lack of splintering and the straightness of the grain, and got to $5.40, which was the first time in her life she had negotiated anything with anyone and won, and she put the money in her pocket and walked out before she let herself feel how much that mattered. At the county seat, she paid 12 cents to pull her deed from the files and read it carefully at the clerk's table with a lamp pulled close. The abandonment clause was there, 3 years, not the full 5 Berta had mentioned. 3 years of demonstrable non-use. She turned the deed over and checked the registration date and the description of the property boundaries, and that was where she found the first thing she hadn't expected. The property was larger than she'd understood. Whispering Falls, as her father had deeded it to her, comprised not 31 acres, as Alderman Cutter had read, but 47. The additional 16 acres ran up the north face of the ridge, up above the falls, into exactly the terrain Mercer had described to the ledger man as containing quality timber stands and the most viable access route for a road. The timber Mercer wanted was on her land. She read the deed twice more, slowly, with the particular care she'd learned from her father for verifying things you couldn't afford to misread. Then she had the clerk make her a copy, paid the 15-cent copy fee, and folded both documents into her inside coat pocket where they would not get wet. She walked out into the gray Garrett's Crossing afternoon and stood on the step for a moment. Her father, it turned out, had been even more deliberate than she'd understood. He hadn't just hidden her home. He had hidden her leverage. Mercer's road couldn't be built without her signature. His entire timber operation on the north face required access through property that belonged to Maren Ruth Whitlock, as registered with the Harwick County Clerk, and dated 14 months before Orson Whitlock died, which meant he had registered this version of the deed long before anyone was reading his will, long before anyone was laughing. He had known what Mercer wanted. He had put it inside her inheritance, like a sealed room inside a mountain, behind a door that looked like something else entirely. She started back toward the road where Bramble waited, and somewhere in the middle of the empty street she felt something shift in her chest. Not the good kind of shift, not the relief she might have expected. Something more complicated. The grief of a father she had just finally begun to understand. The grief of all the years she had thought she was partially set aside, partially apart, the book on the separate shelf, when in fact he had spent 23 years building something for her that she hadn't been allowed to see yet. She walked the rest of the way to Bramble without stopping. She didn't cry this time. She was learning the difference between grief that needed releasing and grief that needed carrying. And this one was the carrying kind. You picked it up and you kept moving and you let it be part of your weight rather than something fighting against you. It was a long ride back. The mountain was waiting. She cut back to the mountain on a Thursday evening with the deed copy folded in her inside pocket and $5.28 remaining after the trip, which was more than she'd had before and less than she needed, which was the permanent condition of her life now, and she was getting accustomed to it. Bramble climbed the switchback in the last of the gray light without complaint. She could feel the temperature dropping as they went up that clean, hard cold that came off the ridge when the sun went down. In late autumn, the kind that didn't negotiate. She had the second blanket from Berta's and the lard and the beans, and she had the deed, and she had what she'd figured out sitting at the county clerk's table with the lamp close and the world rearranging itself quietly around her. She didn't make any decisions that night. She made a fire, fed Bramble the last of the grain she'd brought from Garrett's Crossing, ate beans cooked directly in the pot with a piece of salt pork, and sat by the fire with her father's most recent journal open on her knees. She wasn't reading it exactly. She was looking at his handwriting, the cramped, pressured, leaning letters that she had spent 18 years learning to read and that she would spend the rest of her life recognizing as the handwriting of a man who had known more than he said and said less than he should have, and loved her in the particular difficult way of people who don't know how to make their insides legible. She thought about Mercer's voice in the clearing. If she fails naturally. Most of its windows were dark. She turned that phrase over and looked at it from different angles, the way you turn a rock and look at what was living underneath. He hadn't said anything illegal. He hadn't threatened her directly. He had simply described a preferred outcome and left the implication to do the work, the way a careful man does when he wants something but doesn't want to be the one seen wanting it. She thought about the 16 additional acres on the deed, the north face timber, the access road that couldn't be built without her permission. She had something Mercer needed. He didn't know she knew it yet. She was going to let that sit exactly where it was for now. November came in the way November does in mountain country, not dramatically, but with a kind of settled finality, as if the season had made up its mind. The trees that still had leaves dropped them in a week. The morning frost stopped melting by midday. The sky lost its blue and went to a permanent pewter that made the waterfall look different, starker, louder somehow, the white of it sharper against the gray stone and the stripped trees. Maren worked. She had developed over the preceding weeks a rhythm that her body was beginning to recognize as its own. She woke before full light because the fire needed rebuilding, and the cold made sleeping past a certain point physically impossible. She fed Bramble from the dwindling grain supply, which was a problem she was managing in installments. She ate something, usually cornbread or beans, occasionally salt pork, when she could justify the use of it. Then she worked until the light went, which in November was earlier than she wanted and non-negotiable. The work itself had organized into 3 categories, each one representing a different time horizon: immediate, firewood, food, warmth. The daily business of staying alive on a mountain in November, which absorbed more time and energy than she'd anticipated, and demanded a kind of relentless practical attention that left no room for distraction. Medium, the room behind the falls, improving it, organizing it, making it functional for longer stays. She had managed to get a small cast iron trivet up the cliff face by attaching it to Bramble's pack and then carrying it across the ledge herself in 2 hands, which had been one of the more technically demanding things she had done in her life. The trivet wasn't a stove, but placed under the chimney fissure with a flat hearthstone beneath it. It gave her a way to heat the room that didn't require filling it with smoke. Long-term, her father's work. Continuing it, making it something that would outlast the winter and mean something beyond her own survival. She was in the room one afternoon, working through a journal from 7 years ago and making notes in her own blank book when she found the entry. Her father had written it in October of that year, which would have placed her at 11 years old. She remembered that October only vaguely, the year her half-brothers had both left the household within months of each other. Dale to apprentice, with a millwright in Garrett's Crossing, Ferris to work a farm southeast of town. The house had gone quiet, in a way she hadn't known what to do with. She'd been neither happy nor sad about it, just uncertain what the quiet meant. Her father had written, "The girl is 11 now. She found the false wall in the barn today. I watched her from the door. She did not make noise about it, did not run to tell anyone. She stood in front of the open panel for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the tools inside, and then she closed it carefully and went back to what she had been doing. She did not ask me about it at supper or at any point in the evening. She is waiting until she understands what she's found before she decides what to do with it. I don't know where she learned that. I suspect she learned it the same place I did, necessity. But it is a quality worth watching. Maren read it twice. She was sitting on the three-legged chair in the cold room with the candle making everything amber and unsteady, and she read those two paragraphs twice because first time didn't feel like enough. She had never known he saw her, not like that. Not in that specific way, not as a person with qualities worth recording, worth tracking over time. She had known he loved her or believed it. In the abstract way, you believe things about people who don't say them directly. But this was different. This was evidence. Written down, dated, filed in a journal he had brought up a mountain, and hidden behind a waterfall, where Dale and Ferris and Von Mercer and Alderman Cutter and every person in Briar Hollow who had ever glanced at her and reached a quick conclusion could never find it. She sat with it for a while. Then she got up and went back to work, because sitting with grief had its limits, and she had firewood to split before dark. The first real snow came on a Saturday 2 weeks into November. She woke to it, the particular silence that means the world has been covered overnight, and the pale light coming through the hemlocks that is different from all other light. She lay for a moment taking inventory of herself, hip tolerable, knee better than it had been in days, hands stiff from the cold but functional, and then she got up and pushed out of the hemlock shelter and stood in 4 inches of snow with the fire dead beside her and looked at the world. But everything was white and still. The waterfall was the only sound, lower in volume somehow despite the snowmelt feeding it, as if the snow had absorbed some of its energy. Bramble stood in his pine branch shelter, looking profoundly unenthused, but essentially all right. It was beautiful, and it was a serious problem. She rebuilt the fire with the dry wood she'd been keeping under oilcloth, specifically against this event. She took stock firewood supply sufficient for 3 weeks, if she was careful, 4 if she was disciplined. Food stores adequate but thin. The path down the switchback was going to be treacherous. The snow had covered the loose rock that she'd learned to avoid by feel, and until it melted or froze solid, going down was a different calculation than it had been. She was not trapped, she told herself carefully. She was inconvenienced. She fed Bramble and ate breakfast and decided that the day's most useful thing was to get more dry wood under cover before the snow got deeper, and she spent the morning doing exactly that, working steadily, methodically, making trips from the timber pile to the overhang, stacking wood in the configuration that dried it fastest. Physical work in the cold had a particular quality she was beginning to appreciate. It demanded your whole body and part of your mind, which left the rest of your mind free to think without distraction, the way it couldn't when you were sitting still, and cold could seep in around your thoughts. She was thinking about Mercer. She had been thinking about Mercer more or less continuously since the conversation she'd overheard. Not with dread, exactly, but with the same focused attention she gave to a difficult section of the ledge. Identifying the problem, mapping the options, understanding what she was actually dealing with before she decided how to deal with it. Mercer's position was this. He wanted the timber on her north face acreage, and he wanted an access road through her property. And he believed that patience and cold and isolation would eventually accomplish what his $60 offer had not. He was willing to wait her out. He had resources and comfort and time, which were the specific advantages of men like him over people like her, historically speaking. Her position was this. She had a deed that gave her 47 acres, including the north face. She had a room full of 2 decades of documentation that had value she was only beginning to measure. She had a geological survey suggesting the possible presence of something that would make Mercer's timber operation look modest by comparison. And she had, as of the conversation in the clearing, the specific knowledge that he was willing to benefit from her failure without engineering it himself, which was not illegal, was the kind of thing that certain people, if they knew about it, would find revealing. The question was what to do with all of this. And the answer, she was increasingly convinced, was not what Mercer expected. He expected her to either sell or fail. He had not apparently considered the possibility that she might do something else entirely. It was Alden Pike who came up the mountain first, and his timing was, as Maren would think about afterward, the kind of accidental that changes things permanently. She had heard of Alden Pike without knowing him. He farmed the bottomland south of the Whitlock property, or rather south of what had been the Whitlock property, and was now Dale and Ferris, which meant he was their neighbor rather than hers. He was According to Berta, a quiet man who kept to himself and ran his farm competently and had been widowed some years before and had managed his life since with the self-contained practicality of someone who had learned to be their own company. He was perhaps 30 years old, or near enough to it. He appeared in the clearings where dark coming on a Tuesday morning, coming up the trail on foot with a pack on his back, and stopping when he saw her the way people stop when they find something where they expected nothing. Maren's was splitting wood at the time. She had a rhythm going, set the piece, swing, step back, set the next, and she stopped it and stood with the hatchet in her hand and looked at him. He was medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of face that showed weather without complaint. He looked at her, and then at the camp, and then at the waterfall, with the straight-on attentiveness of someone who was actually looking rather than performing a look. "Miss Whitlock," he said. He didn't say it the way Dale said it, with that calibrated flatness. He said it like a normal person acknowledging another normal person. "Mr. Pike, I heard you were up here." He set his pack down. "I brought some things, if you'll have them." She didn't say anything immediately, because she had learned to wait and see what things actually were before deciding whether to have them. He opened the pack. Cornmeal, a jar of preserves, a hank of dried venison, a small paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be tallow candles, 6 of them, thicker than the ones she'd been using. And at the bottom, wrapped in burlap, a metal stovepipe elbow, the kind that connected a small box stove to a wall flue. She looked at it, then at him. "Berta Suggs mentioned you were trying to make a room habitable," he said. "She mentioned chimney problem." He paused. "I had the elbow in my barn. I didn't have a use for it." Maren looked at the elbow for a long moment. She had been trying to solve the stove problem for 2 weeks. The elbow was exactly the piece she had been able to source without money she didn't have and a trip she hadn't been able to make. "What do you want for it?" she asked. He looked surprised, like the question hadn't occurred to him. "Nothing. I just said, I didn't have a use for it. People don't usually bring things up a mountain for nothing," she said. It wasn't accusatory, just factual. She had learned to be careful about what she accepted and what it was going to come close her in ways she hadn't accounted for. He thought about that. "My wife is buried at the east edge of my property," he said, which was not what she expected him to say. "She died 4 years ago. She was a woman who did what she thought needed doing and didn't wait for someone to tell her it was all right. And she had no patience with people who let difficulty turn into excuse." He stopped. "I'm not comparing you to her. I just mean I have a high regard for stubbornness applied in the right direction. It doesn't require payment." Maren looked at the stovepipe elbow. "Thank you," she said. "The elbow won't help you much without a stove box," he added. "I know where you can get one cheaply. There's a widow in Garrett's Crossing who's been trying to sell off household things. Her son already brought her a newer model, and the old box stove is sitting in her yard taking weather. How much? $2, maybe less if you catch her on the right day." He stood up, resettling his pack. "I'm not trying to manage your business. I just know the terrain down there better than the terrain up here." He started toward the trail. "Mr. Pike," she said. He stopped. "The stovepipe. Can you help me figure out how to get a box stove up the cliff face? I've been working on that problem for a while, and I haven't found a satisfying answer." He turned around. For the first time, he looked slightly interested in something beyond politeness. He looked at the waterfall, at the cliff face beside it, at Bramble, at the rope hanging from the cedar she'd left in place since the first crossing. "Show me the problem," he said. She showed him. She did not take him into the room. She was not ready for that, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't fully know him yet, and some things you kept close until you understood what keeping them close was actually protecting. She took him to the ledge and showed him the crossing and the entrance to the tunnel from the outside, framed it as a natural cave system she was trying to use, which was not entirely untrue. Its windows were dark. He stood at the approach to the ledge and looked at it with the same straight-on attention he'd given everything else. "You've been crossing that," he said. "Yes." He looked at the rope line she'd established cedar and cord at one end, the working length draped across the cliff face to provide a handhold through the difficult section. He looked at the gap, the drop, the wet rock. "Alone," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of judgment. She had become very good at distinguishing the silence of judgment from other kinds of silence. And this was not that. This was the silence of a man running through logistics. getting a stove box across that ledge. He said, "You'd need at minimum 2 people and a rope rigging I could design, but haven't built yet. You'd need to break the stove down if it's a 2-part construction, haul each piece separately. Bramble can get the weight up the switchback, but the lateral transfer is the constraint." He looked at the cedar anchor. "Your rope line needs a second anchor partway along. 1 anchor point for a load transfer like that isn't sufficient." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about where to put the second anchor." "That rock shelf at about the midpoint," he said, pointing. "If there's a crack in the face there wide enough for a spike, you could drive an anchor pin and run a secondary line." She looked at where he was pointing. She had looked at that shelf a dozen times and thought the same thing without knowing whether a spike would hold. "I don't have a rock spike," she said. "I do," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not trying to involve myself where I'm not wanted," he said, and there was no false modesty in it. It was a genuine statement of intention with a genuine caveat. "I can bring the spike and a hammer next week if you want. I can help you rig the transfer. After that, what you do with the space is your business." She thought about it. She had been alone on this mountain for weeks, and she had managed, and she was going to keep managing. She didn't need help in the desperate way, the way that made you accept bad terms from people who offered. But there was a difference between needing help and being able to use it, and she was old enough and realistic enough to understand that difference was not a weakness. "All right," she said. "Next Tuesday," he said. "Unless the snow comes heavier." "Next Tuesday," she agreed. He went back down the mountain. She watched him go from the clearing, noting the way he moved through the terrain careful, aware of his footing, without making a production of it. A man who'd spent his life on land like this. She went back to splitting wood. Mercer came on a Thursday. This time he came alone, which was different. The ledger man wasn't with him, and Mercer without an audience was a different version of himself, less performed, more direct. He came into the clearing and found Maren at the fire eating her lunch, which was beans, and he stood across the fire from her and didn't pretend he'd come for any reason other than the one he'd come for. "Miss Whitlock, I want to speak plainly." "All right. My offer is $75. Final." He let that sit for a moment. "The timber market doesn't stay favorable indefinitely. If I find another viable parcel, the offer disappears. I'm telling you this directly because I respect that you've been persistent." He sounded like he meant the respect, which was almost worse than if he hadn't. "I found my deed," Maren said. Something in his expression shifted very slightly, the way something shifts in still water when something moves beneath it. "Of course." Alderman Cutter read it at the full deed, she said. "The registered version at the county seat. 47 acres, Mr. Mercer, not 31. The shift became something less subtle. "The north face acreage is in my deed," she continued, keeping her voice level. "Including the timber stands you've been discussing and the only viable route for an access road." She set her bowl down on the stone beside the fire. "Which means your operation on the north face requires my cooperation, not just my absence." Mercer was quiet. His face had gone to something she couldn't read, precisely not anger, not embarrassment, something more complicated than both. The face of a man encountering a wall where he'd mapped a clear path. "The survey I had done," he began. "I'd be interested to see who did that survey," Maren said. "Because my father surveyed this land himself 14 months before he died and had it registered at the county. So whoever told you the north face wasn't on my deed either made an error or was working from incomplete information." She'd not say, or was working from information that had been deliberately shaped. She did not say it, because she wasn't certain, and because she was not going to accuse a man of that in an open clearing with no witnesses. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. "What do you want?" he said finally. It was the first time he had ever asked her that. Every other interaction had been about what he wanted, offered on his terms, with the assumption that her role was to accept or decline. This was different. This was the sentence that comes out when the landscape has changed enough that a man has to recalibrate. She thought about what she wanted. She had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since the county clerk's table, and she had an answer. But she had also learned from her father's journals that the moment you name what is the moment negotiation truly begins. And you don't begin from your highest position if you intend to finish from your strongest one. "I want to think about it," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. He was not a man accustomed to being told that. "The offer Your offer was $75 for my land, she said. What I'm talking about now is something different. I need time to think about what different looks like. She picked her bowl back up. Come back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks is 2 weeks, she said, and she held his eyes. She said it without aggression and without apology, just the simple steadiness of someone who has decided the terms of the conversation and is comfortable waiting out the discomfort of the person who hasn't caught up yet. He left. She ate her beans. Her hand was shaking slightly when she put the bowl down, not fear, she didn't think, more like the physiological aftermath of having held yourself very still for a very long time, the way a held breath shakes when you finally let it go. Alden Pike came back the following Tuesday with a rock spike, a hammer, and a box stove disassembled into 2 parts, strapped to a wooden sledge he'd built for the purpose. Getting the stove across the ledge took 3 hours. It was not elegant. The stove body swung on the rope twice, in ways that Maren's stomach didn't enjoy, and Alden dropped the hammer once on the ledge, and they both watched it skitter toward the edge, before catching on a rock outcrop 6 inches from the drop. And they looked at each other across the cliff face with the specific expression of people who have just been reminded that things can go wrong quickly and in multiple directions simultaneously. The anchor spike held. That was what mattered. Alden had driven it into a crack in the rock face with the focus and care of someone who understood the distinction between being confident in a thing and being cavalier about it, and it held under the load without any drama. When the stove box finally made it through the tunnel entrance, Maren sat down on the ledge for a moment and breathed. Alden sat beside her, not close, with the particular distance of a man who was aware of boundaries without making the awareness awkward. "Thank you," she said. "It wasn't nothing," he said, which was the honest answer. It wasn't. They sat there for a moment with the sound of the falls surrounding them. Then he stood up. "I should get back down before the light goes," he said. "Yes." He started back along the ledge. Then he stopped without turning around, the same way Berta Sussex had done on her first visit. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She would have thought what you're doing up here was the most sensible thing she'd ever heard of. I thought you should know that." He kept walking. Maren sat on the ledge for a minute after he disappeared around the curve of the cliff face, with the falls roaring below her and the cold coming off the mountain in slow, certain waves. Then she got up and went into the tunnel where the stove box was waiting to become something useful. She had work to do. She had, in fact, more work ahead of her than she could fully see yet, which was different from how it had felt 3 weeks ago, when more work had meant only more difficulty. Now it meant more possibility, which was a different weight to carry. The afternoon light through the chimney fissure caught the stove's iron surface and made it look, briefly, like something her father might have planned. She thought he probably had. The stove changed everything about the room, and not only in the obvious way. Yes, it was warmer. That was immediate and undeniable. The first morning she woke up in the room behind the falls with the small iron box radiating heat through the chimney fissure, she lay on the cot she'd built from split pine and hemlock boughs and felt something she hadn't felt since before her father's illness began, the particular luxury of being warm without having to work for it every single moment. The cold was still outside. The mountain was still the mountain. But inside, in the amber light of a single candle and the red glow around the stove's iron door, there was a pocket of human warmth that the mountain could not reach. And she lay in it for 20 minutes longer than she needed to and did not feel guilty about a single one of them. But the bigger change was more subtle than warmth. Having the stove meant she could be in the room for hours at a stretch without the cold becoming an emergency, which meant she could read more, draw more, think more without interrupting herself every 40 minutes to go rebuild a fire somewhere else. The room stopped being a place she visited and started being a place she inhabited. Most of its windows were dark, and that shift, the difference between visiting and inhabiting, changed her relationship to everything her father had left inside it. She began reading the journals in a more organized way. She set herself a pace, 2 journals per week, moving forward chronologically, making notes in her own book as she went, cross-referencing against the maps, building, slowly, a picture of this valley that was more complete than anything she'd seen in her 18 years of living in it. Her father had been watching a lot of things simultaneously: the natural history plants, insects, birds, the seasonal patterns of each. The water systems where the springs ran, how they changed in drought years versus wet years, which ones were reliable and which ones failed. The mineral geology, not just the quartz vein on the north face, but a dozen smaller observations scattered through the journals, the cumulative weight of which was suggesting something she wasn't yet qualified to fully interpret, but that felt significant in the way that things feel significant when a pattern emerges from what looked like noise. And then there were the observations about people. Not gossip. Her father was not a gossip, and the journals were not a diary in the personal sense. But occasionally, at the end of an entry, he had added a note that stepped back from the natural world and looked at the human one. Observations about land use patterns in the valley, about which families were expanding their footprint and how, about the way certain men talked about timber and water and soil as if those things existed for the purpose of being used up. He had written in a journal from 11 years ago, "There is a category of man who looks at a living system and sees only its extraction value. The valley has always had them. What's different now is that they have capital behind them, which changes the speed at which damage can be done. The question for this work is whether documentation alone constitutes a sufficient response. I don't know the answer yet." Maren read that entry 3 times. She thought about Mercer and his clean coat and his ledgerman, and the access road that would need to be cut through her north face to get his operation running. She thought about the timber stands above the fall's mature hemlocks that her father had been observing and documenting for 2 decades, stands that Mercer saw as board feet and dollar amounts, and that her father had seen as a living thing worth understanding. She thought about what her father had written, whether documentation alone constitutes a sufficient response. She was beginning to think the answer was no. Documentation was the foundation, but foundations needed something built on top of them. 2 weeks after she'd told Mercer to come back, he came back. He arrived on a Wednesday in the first hard freeze of November, when the ground rang like iron under boots, and the waterfall had a fringe of ice forming along its edges where the spray hit exposed rock and stopped moving. He was alone again, and he was wearing a heavier coat than the last time, but it was still clean in the way his coats always were. Maren met him at the edge of the clearing. She had spent the preceding 2 weeks preparing for this conversation the way her father had spent years preparing this valley carefully, quietly, without announcing what she was doing until she was ready to do it. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She gestured to the flat rock near the fire that she sometimes used as a seat. "Sit if you want," he sat, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to prefer standing, the posture of a man conducting business on his terms. But he sat, which meant something about how the calculation had shifted for him since her mention of the 47 acres. She sat across from him. "I've been thinking about what you asked," she said, "what I want, and I'm not selling the land," she said, "not any of it. So if that's what you came to negotiate, we're done before we start." He held her eyes. His face went through something, the briefest contraction of something that might have been frustration, and then settled into the neutral, careful expression of a man who had decided to hear the rest before he reacted. "What I'm willing to consider," she continued, "is an agreement, not a sale. A limited-term easement on the North Face access route, meaning you get the right to use that path for a defined period, to move timber you harvest from your own adjacent property, which is west of my boundary line and not subject to this conversation." She paused. "In exchange, you agree in writing to no harvesting on my North Face acreage. None. Not a single tree without a separate written negotiation. And you agree that the terms of this easement are registered at the county seat so that they are a matter of public record." Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and she recognized in his stillness the same kind of stillness she used herself, the stillness of someone processing rather than shutting down. "You've thought about this," he said. "Yes. The easement term you're proposing, 5 years, she said. At the end of 5 years, we renegotiate or it expires. I'm not giving you permanent access to my land. I'm giving you a temporary arrangement with defined limits." He looked up from the fire. "And if I build the road and access improves for the whole area, for your supply runs, for trade, generally, then the valley benefits," she said, "which is separate from what you owe me for the right to build it." He almost smiled, not warmly, but with the specific appreciation of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he had not expected to outmaneuver him. and who has enough self-possession to acknowledge it without making a scene. What's the easement fee, he said. $80, she said. Paid when the agreement is signed. Not 75 for the whole property, 80 for a 5-year road right. The almost smile went away. He looked at the fire again. She let the silence sit. She had learned partly from her father's journals, partly from 3 weeks on a mountain with a lot of time that think silence in a negotiation belongs to the person who is comfortable in it, and she had become very comfortable with silence. 70, he said. 78, she said. He looked at her. I'm not moving to 75, she said. You can have 78, or we can keep talking. He breathed out through his nose, stood up, looked at the waterfall, that long, assessing look she had seen the first time he came into this clearing, the look of a man calculating value. Then he looked back at her. 78, he said. Registered at the county. Registered at the county, she confirmed. I'll have the terms written out and ready by Friday. He nodded once, picked up his hat from the rock beside him, and walked toward the trail. He didn't look back. Maren sat by the fire for a long time after he left, not because she was savoring anything, but because her legs had gone slightly unsteady, and she didn't trust herself to stand up and look composed at the same time. She had just negotiated the first contract of her life with the most powerful landowner in the county, and she had won the terms she wanted, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and relieved and aware, in a deep and specific way, of how much had depended on her not flinching. $78. It was more money than she had ever held at one time. It was also a boundary drawn in public record around her land, around her father's work, around the thing she was building here. She thought, this is what he meant by not selling. Not just don't sell the land, don't sell the possibility. She wrote the easement terms herself, working at the table in the room behind the falls by candlelight, referencing the deed language she'd copied at the county seat and a general legal form she'd found in one of her father's reference books. It took 2 drafts. The second draft she took down to Berta, who read it without comment, and then read it again, and then set it on the counter. Where did you learn to write something like this? Berta asked. Father had a book. Your father had everything. Berta slid it back across the counter. It's sound enough. Get a witness when he signs. I was going to ask you. Berta looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that contained more than it expressed. Your father would have been, she stopped. Started again. He wouldn't have said anything. You know how he was. But he would have found some reason to stay in the room longer than he needed to. That was how you knew with him. Maren folded the paper carefully. Berta, she said. Did he talk to you about the room? The one behind the falls? Berta's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. He told me there was something up there worth protecting, she said. He didn't tell me what. He asked me, once, to promise that if anything happened to him before he'd finished what he was working on, I'd make sure you knew to look. She paused. I was going to tell you. At the will reading. But you had already made the decision to go up, so I thought it was better to let you find it yourself. That's what he would have wanted, Maren said. That's what I thought too. Berta looked out the window at the cold gray street. He was a stubborn man who loved his daughter in the most complicated and inconvenient way possible. He should have just told you directly. I'm sorry he didn't. He told me, Maren said. He just told me in a way that took me longer to read. She tucked the folded agreement into her coat, same as everything else with him. Mercer signed the easement on a Friday morning at the trading post, with Berta as witness and the document dated and countersigned and ready for the county seat. He handed Maren $78 in bills and coin, and she counted it at the counter without apology, and he watched her do it with the particular stillness of a man recalibrating a long-held position. He left without conversation. Maren pocketed the money. Berta made a note in her ledger. Don't spend it all on things that won't last, Berta said. I'm buying a wood stove, Maren said. A proper one. For the room, that'll last. And seeds, Maren said. Native varieties. I need to replenish what Father collected. Some of the older stock is too old to be reliable. She thought about the seed shelf in the room, the careful labels in her father's hand. What she was building there was not just a shelter or an archive. It was a living thing. The same way her father's work had been a living thing, something that grew and changed and required tending. And I need paper. Good paper and ink. I'm going to start making the maps legible for other people. Berta looked at her. What other people? I don't know yet, Maren said. But Father documented this valley for 23 years, and nobody knows it exists. That seems like a waste. She pulled on her coat. There might be people who'd want to know. Natural historians. University people. Someone who works in geology. She paused. The documentation doesn't stop being valuable just because it's been hidden. Berta studied her for a moment with that reading expression. You're going to make something of it, she says. It was not quite a question. I'm going to try, Maren said. Which isn't the same thing, but it's the start of the same thing. The storm came in the 3rd week of November, and it came fast. She had seen it building for 2 days in the sky above the North Ridge, that particular stacking of gray on gray, that mountain people learned to read early and respect deeply. She had laid in as much firewood as she could manage and gotten the room provisioned and checked the rope line on the ledge crossing twice, and on the evening of the 2nd day, she had gone to sleep in the room behind the falls with the stove burning low and the sound of the wind beginning outside, and told herself she was as ready as she was going to be. She was not ready for what happened. The storm hit at some point in the night, and by morning the world had been fundamentally rearranged. She knew it before she could see it, she could hear it. The falls had changed sound entirely, going from their constant thunder to something more erratic. A sound with a violence in it she hadn't heard before, because the runoff from the storm was hitting the top of the falls all at once and sending the volume down in surges, rather than the steady fall she'd grown accustomed to. And underneath that sound, barely audible, something else, wind in the chimney fissure, which had never happened before, which meant the storm was pushing from an unusual direction. She built up the stove and waited for enough light to see by. When she looked out through the tunnel toward the falls curtain, the world outside was gray-white and moving. Not snow rain, but rain so hard it had substance to it, mixed with something that wasn't quite sleet. The falls were running twice their normal volume. The pool at the base was up several feet and churning in a way that turned her stomach slightly. The ledge crossing, she thought immediately. She looked at it from inside the tunnel. The ledge was wetter than usual, which was saying something, and the section near the gap had water running over it in a thin, continuous sheet from the increased spray. She was not going to cross that today. She was, for the first time since she'd come to Whispering Falls, genuinely confined. Not inconvenienced. Confined. The mountain had closed around her in a way that was not dangerous. Exactly, she had food, she had warmth, she had the room, but that removed choice in a way she hadn't experienced before and didn't entirely like. She spent the morning reading. She spent part of the afternoon working on a map transcription, taking one of her father's original maps and redrawing it in cleaner lines with neater notation, the kind of thing another person could read without knowing his personal shorthand. She was getting better at this. Her drawing wasn't at her father's level yet and might never be, but it was functional, which was what the maps needed to be. In the afternoon, the sound changed again. She couldn't identify it immediately. She put down her pencil and listened. Over the falls and the rain and the wind in the fissure, there was something else. A human sound. Not words too far and too muffled for that, but a voice. More than one voice. She went to the tunnel entrance and looked out through the curtain of water. On the far side of the creek, barely visible through the rain and the churned-up air, an overturned wagon, a horse standing with its head down, and 2 figures, one large, one very small, on a rock shelf that the rising creek had turned into a shrinking island, maybe 30 feet across the water, maybe more. Her stomach dropped and then steadied. She made herself stand still for 30 seconds and look at the situation before she moved. The creek between her position and theirs was not the creek she'd been living beside for weeks. It was a different animal, entirely brown, with silt and debris, moving fast, maybe 4 feet deep at the center. The rock shelf they were on was still above the water line, but the water was rising. The small figure was a child, she could see that now. The larger one was a woman. The woman was looking toward Maren's side of the creek. She might have seen the tunnel entrance, or she might just have been looking for anything that wasn't water and rain. She didn't appear to be hurt, or not badly. She was upright, and she had her arms around the child. Maren turned back into the tunnel. She took inventory. 2 long ropes, 1 medium weight, 1 heavier. The anchor spike Alden had driven into the cliff face was on the other side of the ledge, which she couldn't use today. She had the Seacher anchor in the clearing. If she could get to the clearing, which meant she had to cross the wet ledge after all. She stood with her hands on both ropes and breathed. This was the calculation. Cross a wet ledge in a storm to reach the clearing, using the rope line as her only safeguard, knowing the ledge was running with water and the gap section would be worse than it had ever been. Get to the clearing. Set a rope across the creek, which was 30 feet minimum, possibly more with the current pulling it, and get those two people across somehow. Or don't cross the ledge. Stay in the tunnel where it was safe. Watch from here and hope the water didn't rise fast enough. She knew what the water looked like. She had watched it come up 6 inches in the time she'd been standing here. She took both ropes. The ledge crossing was the most frightening thing she had ever done, and she had done frightening things with enough frequency now that her scale was calibrated against a higher baseline than it used to be. The water running over the ledge wasn't deep an inch. Maybe 2 but an inch of moving water on wet rock is enough to erase the margin between controlled and not. And she moved through it with both hands flat in the cliff face and her weight so deliberately placed that each step felt like a separate decision made at the level of bone rather than thought. The gap was worst. The rope was slick in her hands. She could hear the pool 60 feet below, louder than she'd ever heard it, and she did not look down because looking down was information she did not need and could not use. She stepped across. The cedar in the clearing was still there, still solid, its roots immune to the storm's opinions. She tied one rope to it with a bowline, and the rope's full length 40 feet fell short of the far bank by several feet when she threw it. She pulled it back and thought. The woman on the far shelf was watching her now. The child had his face pressed against the woman's coat. She tied the second rope to the end of the first. Extension. It wasn't ideal, the junction point was a weakness, but she had looked at the woman and the child and made a decision that the weakness was acceptable against the alternative. The doubled rope reached. The end of it fell onto the rock shelf, and the woman grabbed it immediately, which meant she understood what was happening without needing it explained, which meant she was clear-headed enough to think. That was good. What Maren did next was not elegant, and it was not the kind of thing that looks heroic from the outside, because it looked exactly like what it was. A heavy young woman in a soaked coat bracing herself against a cedar tree in a storm, using her full body weight as a counterpoint against a rope that had 2 people's lives on the other end. She wrapped the rope twice around the cedar for friction. She set her feet wide and her back low, and she thought about the river pulling, and she pulled the other direction. Her hands, even through the rope, felt the first person start to cross. The rope went taut in a different way, a moving load way, the weight shifting and lurching as the person in the water fought the current. She did not let it move. She held the rope, and the cedar held the rope, and she thought about nothing, except the point where the rope met her hands, and whether that point was staying where she needed it. The child came across. First the woman had tied him to herself with something, and then unclipped him and held the rope with both hands, and he came through the water fast, more carried by the rope than swimming, and when he hit the bank, Maren caught him with one arm and kept the other on the rope, and he was shaking and soaked, and 7 or 8 years old, and he grabbed her coat with both fists and didn't make a sound. The woman was harder. The current was pulling the rope sideways, and the woman was fighting both the current and the angle, and Maren could feel it in her shoulders, in the specific muscles along her upper back that had been building for 2 months on a mountain. And she thought this is what this was for. Not as a thought exactly, more as something the body already knew. She held. The woman made the bank. She was on her hands and knees in the mud beside the creek, and then Maren had her arm and was pulling her up right moment, and the 3 of them stood there in the rain for a moment. 2 strangers, and a soaked child, and a young woman with rope. Burns on both hands, doing nothing but breathing. "Can you walk?" Maren said. The woman looked at her. She was maybe 40, with dark circles under her eyes, and the specific look of someone who has just been through something that rearranged their understanding of what a bad day is. "Yes," she said. "Come with me." Getting across the ledge with 2 extra people was something she had not fully thought through, and was, in the event, the second most frightening thing she had ever done within a span of roughly 40 minutes. She went across first with the child, one hand on the cliff face and one hand holding the boy's wrist, talking to him the entire time in a low and steady voice about where to put each foot, and he was frightened, but he was not paralyzed, which she appreciated. The woman came across last with the rope in both hands and her eyes on the rock and not on the drop, which was the right choice. And when all three of them were inside the tunnel, Maren let herself exhale. She brought them into the room. The woman stopped in the doorway. The boy stopped with her. They looked at the shelves, the maps, the journals, the stove. With its red glow, the candles, the organized evidence of 23 years of careful attention. The woman looked at it the way people look at things they cannot immediately categorize. Sit, Maren said. She meant it practically. There was a chair, and she could drag the trunk from the corner, and there were blankets in the chest by the wall. I'll get the fire up. She got the fire up. She made something hot from the provisions on the shelf, a broth, thin but warm, with dried venison and a handful of dried herbs from one of her father's collection jars. She wasn't sure if the herbs were food herbs or documentation herbs, and she made a judgment call. The boy drank it with both hands around the cup. The woman drank it and then sat, looking at the walls. What is this place? She asked. Maren sat down on the three-legged chair and looked around the room that had been her father's secret for 23 years, and was now hers. It belonged to my father, she said. He left it to me. The woman looked at her. She had stopped shaking. The boy had fallen asleep against her side, which was the profound practical recovery ability of children. You live up here, she said, on the mountain. Yes. Alone, yes. The woman was quiet for a moment. Your rope, she said. If you hadn't had the rope ready. She stopped. It's a good thing to have rope ready, Maren said. The storm broke on the second day, and Maren brought them down the mountain the day after that, in cold, clear air, with the creek back within its banks, and the falls running hard and silver against a pale blue sky. The woman's name was Miriam Connell. The boy was her son Thomas. They were traveling from the county east of Harwick to join Miriam's sister in a town 2 days further, and the creek crossing had gone wrong in the dark and the storm. Getting them back to Briar Hollow took most of the morning. Miriam walked steadily and without complaint, and Thomas walked beside Maren, asking her questions about the mountain with the relentless factual curiosity of a child who had already processed his fear and moved on to documentation. What kind of bird is that? Junco. Why does the water make that color? Tannins from the leaves. It's normal. Is that your mule? Yes. What's his name? Bramble. Why? Because he doesn't go around things. He goes through them. Thomas considered this. Like you, he said, with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften observations. Maren looked at him. He was looking up at her with perfect seriousness. I suppose, she said. Briar Hollow was not a large town, and Miriam Connell's story reached it before they did. The way stories in small towns always do ahead of their own subjects, already taking shape in people's mouths. By the time Maren brought Miriam and Thomas down the main street, Berta Suggs was standing outside her trading post with her arms folded, and 2 other women had come out of the dry goods store, and Alderman Cutter was visible in his doorway. Miriam told it plainly, to whoever was there to listen. The storm, the crossing, the overturned wagon, the rope from the mountain, the young woman who had come across the ledge in a storm and held the line while 2 strangers pulled themselves to safety. The room behind the waterfall, and she described it with the accuracy of a woman who didn't exaggerate because she didn't need to. Books, map, drawings, a stove, a working chimney, a home fully furnished inside the mountain. Maren stood to one side while this happened. She had not orchestrated it. She had not planned for Miriam to tell it in public, or to tell it in a way that made people stop and look at Maren differently than they had looked at her before. She had simply brought 2 people down a mountain, and the rest was happening on its own. Dale was at the far end of the street. She saw him when she looked up. He was standing very still, watching, with an expression she couldn't read from that distance. For once he wasn't calculating anything visible. He was just watching. Ferris was beside him. Ferris was looking at the ground. Mercer was not on the street, but she knew the story would reach him. It would reach the county seat. It would travel in the way that stories travel, when they contain something people find worth repeating, the basic stubborn fact of a person doing what they said they'd do. Berta pushed through the small crowd and handed Maren a cup of something hot without comment. Maren took it. Her rope-burned hands were stiff in the cold. The room, Berta said quietly, standing beside her. People are going to want to see it now. I know. What are you going to do about that? Maren thought about the journals, the maps, the geological survey on the 3rd shelf, and what it might mean. and who she wanted to talk to about it before she talked to anyone else. The rest of its windows were dark. She thought about the seed collection and the drawings and the 23 years of documentation that her father had spent his life building in a room he had never shown anyone. "I'm going to control what they see and when," she said. Same as he did, just not hidden. Berta looked at her sideways. "That's a harder thing to do." "Yes," Maren said, "it is." The surveyor came in December on a day when the first light snow of the seasons was coming down in small, dry flakes that didn't commit to anything. His name was Hartwell, and Berta had recommended him, had in fact written him a letter on Maren's behalf that she'd never mentioned until he showed up, which was how Berta expressed things she considered important, but didn't want to make a production of. He was a careful man with careful instruments, and he spent 2 full days documenting the room and its contents, working methodically through the shelves, while Maren sat at the table and answered questions and controlled what she let him copy versus what she described in general terms. The geological survey she described but did not let him copy. The maps she let him study and trace. The journals she let him read selectively, with her at his elbow. At the end of the second day, he sat across from her at the table with his notes in front of him, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered that something has been where he didn't expect to find it. "Your father," he said, "Orson Whitlock." "Yes, I'm familiar with the name from county records. He was listed as a trapper," he was, Maren said, "among other things." Hartwell looked at the shelf of journals. "Miss Whitlock. The botanical documentation alone, there are species in those journals that don't appear in any published survey of this region. The water mapping is, I've seen professional hydrological surveys less thorough." He paused. "The mineral notations, I can't fully assess without a separate geological consultation, but I know what the mineral notations suggest," Maren said. "I've read them." He looked at her. "I haven't decided what to do about them yet," she said. "I'm going to decide carefully and slowly, and when I decide, I'll be the one who initiates any consultation, not the other direction." He held her eyes for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating the same recalibration she had seen in Mercer, in Dale, in every person who had come up this mountain accepting something and found something different. The recalibration of people who had formed a picture in their minds of what an 18-year-old girl living alone on a mountain with a mule would be, and had encountered the reality of what she actually was. "Understood," he said. January, Alden Pike came up the mountain on the first clear day of the new year, with a sack over his shoulder and no particular stated reason, which by now was how she knew he had something he wanted to say. He helped her reinforce the pine board wall on the east side of the camp, shelter the outside camp, not the room, which she still hadn't shown him fully. She wasn't sure why she was waiting. She had shown Miriam and Thomas, she had shown the surveyor. She had described it to Berta in enough detail that Berta could picture it. Most of its windows were dark, but showing Alden felt like a different category of thing, and she hadn't been able to figure out why until she was holding one end of a board, and he was hammering the other end into place, and she thought, because everything else I've shown people has been about the work. Showing him would be about something else. She wasn't ready to name what that something else was. They worked until noon and ate cold cornbread beside the fire, and he told her, in his way in pieces, without making it into anything more than it was, that he had spoken to a man he knew in Garrett's Crossing who had connections at a university in the state capital. A man who was building a collection of regional natural history documentation. He had mentioned, without specifics, that there was an unusual body of work in the Harwick County mountains that might be of interest. "I should have asked before I said anything," he said. "I'm sorry for that." "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he'd be interested in corresponding." She looked at the fire. She thought about her father's question, written in a journal 11 years ago, whether documentation alone constitutes a sufficient response. She had been thinking about it for 2 months. She had been building toward an answer without fully naming it. "Tell him to write," she said. Alden looked at her. The winter light was pale and flat, and it made everything look clean, which was mostly a lie but an appealing one. "Your father's work," he said. "What you're doing with it. What do you want it to become?" She had thought about this more than almost anything else. More than Mercer, more than the deed, more than money or supplies or winter logistics. She had lain in the room behind the falls, listening to the water, and thought about it, and stopped being a question she was afraid of, and started being a question she could answer. I want it to be what it actually is, she said. Not a secret, not someone's extraction opportunity, not a curiosity. She turned to look at him. Documentation of a living valley, made by someone who understood that the value of a place isn't what you can take out of it. That's what he spent 23 years doing. I want to finish it. And then I want people who care about that kind of thing to know it exists. Alden was quiet for a moment. That's a long project, he said. I know. You could use help, he said, with the practical parts. The camp, the access. I'm not talking about the work itself. That's yours. He looked at her directly, in the manner of someone who has decided to say the thing instead of approaching it at an angle. I'm talking about the rest of it. I have a farm that runs itself pretty well by now, and a particular interest in the well-being of this mountain, if you were willing. She looked at him. He was not a perfect man. She had known him long enough to see his imperfections, the way he went quiet when he was troubled, instead of saying so. The slight inflexibility in how he organized his days, the grief he still carried for her that surfaced sometimes, in an expression he didn't know she'd noticed. She was not a perfect woman. She had a temper she kept well controlled, but not perfectly controlled. A tendency to mistake patience for permission to avoid things she found difficult, and a stubbornness that had saved her life, and would probably also cause her significant problems in the future. None of that felt like a reason to say no. I'm willing to talk about it, she said. It was not a declaration. It was an opening, which was what the moment called for. And she had learned from her father, and from everything this mountain had taught her, that openings were where things actually began, not in the finished version, not in the resolved and also settled conclusion, but in the first honest moment where two people looked at each other and said, here is what I have, and here is what I'm willing to consider. He nodded, and she turned back to the fire, and the water came down behind them as it always had, steady and enormous and indifferent to the small human things happening in its shadow. Spring came the way it always comes to mountain country, arguing with itself for weeks before it committed. There was snow in March that erased everything, and then sun in April that made it seem like the snow had been a dream. And by May, the hemlocks were putting out new growth, and the waterfall was running high with snowmelt, and the clearing around Maren's camp was unrecognizable from what it had been in October. She had a proper camp now. Not a homestead, not yet, but something that intended to become one. A log-framed shelter with a real floor and a small stone chimney of her own, supplementing the room behind the falls rather than replacing it. A paddock for bramble, fenced in the lower part of the clearing. A garden plot, turned and composted, waiting for the first seeds from her father's collection to go in. She had begun, also, a correspondence with the man at the university, whose name was Professor Ellard, and who had written her 3 long letters in the preceding months that made it clear he understood exactly what he was looking at in Orson Whitlock's work, and that his interest was genuine rather than acquisitive. They had not yet agreed to terms for any formal arrangement. She was not in a hurry. She had learned from her father that the right agreements, made slowly and carefully, lasted longer than the ones made quickly under pressure. Mercer's easement road was under construction on the south approach. She could hear it some mornings, the distant sound of timber work and men's voices coming up the valley. She had ridden down to look at the construction twice, checking that the road was staying within the agreed boundaries, which it was. Mercer, to his credit, had complied precisely with the terms of the document. She had not underestimated him, and she thought now, with some distance, that he had finally stopped underestimating her. Dale had not been back up the mountain. Ferris had come once. Alone, in February, with no stated purpose, and a manner that was the closest he had ever managed to apologetic without actually being apologetic. He had looked at the camp and the paddock and the cleared garden plot and not said anything about any of it, and she hadn't needed him to. Some things resolve themselves not in words, but in a long silence, where something that used to be contested just stops being contested. She had not forgiven Dale. She thought about, the dark. She thought about forgiveness the way you think about a word you know the definition of, but have trouble using in a sentence, understanding what it was supposed to mean, without being sure you knew what it felt like in practice. She had decided this was a question for another year. She had enough questions for this year. On a morning in late May, Maren Whitlock sat at the table in her father's room with his most recent journal open in front of her and her own journal open beside it and a pot of ink and the good paper she'd bought with part of the easement money, and she worked on the map. She had been working on this particular map for a month. Was the valley map the comprehensive one, the center of her father's cartographic work, and she was rendering it in clean lines that another person could read, with a legend she was inventing as she went, and notation that combined his system and her own additions. It was not finished. It would not be finished for months, maybe longer. She was adding observations he hadn't made, because she was seeing things he hadn't been here to see. The way the spring snowmelt changed the creek pattern, the new bird species she'd documented in the East Hemlock stand, the water source she'd found above the falls that wasn't on any of his maps. The room was warm. The stove was burning low. Through the chimney fissure, morning light came in at its familiar angle and fell across the table in a stripe that moved slowly as the morning progressed, which she started to use as a rough clock. Outside, behind the curtain of falling water, the world was continuing. The mountain was doing what it had always done, growing things, breaking things down, moving water from one place to another, not caring at all what Maren Whitlock or Von Mercer or anyone else thought about the process. She had stopped wanting the mountain to care. That had been a thing she'd had to let go of the desire for the landscape, to reflect back what you felt about it, to be dramatic when things were dramatic and peaceful when things were peaceful. The mountain was neither of those things. It was just the mountain, old beyond her ability to think about it clearly, doing its work at a pace that made her entire life a footnote. There was comfort in that, she had discovered. Not the comfort of being protected, but the comfort of scale. The reminder that the things she was worried about Mercer's approval, Dale's opinions, most of its windows were dark. The question of whether she was strong enough or capable enough, or the right shape for the life she was trying to live, were very small against 100 feet of falling water that had been falling since, before anyone in the valley had a name for anything. She was not thin. She would not become thin. Her body was exactly what it had always been, doing work it was finding itself equal to in ways she hadn't predicted and couldn't have asked for. She was stronger than she'd been in October, in the specific ways that mountain life produces strength. And she was also still recognizably and permanently herself the same woman who had sat in a creaking chair at Alderman Cutter's and held very still, while people decided her inheritance was a joke. She thought sometimes about that woman, that 18-year-old sitting with her hands folded. She thought she was already more than she looked. She just didn't know it yet. That was the thing no one tells you, and maybe no one can tell you, because it has to be discovered rather than received, that the measure people put on you when they look at you quickly is almost never accurate. Not because they're all malicious. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But because a quick look only catches the surface, and most of what is true about a person lives somewhere underneath, in the place where their patience lives and their stubbornness, and the quality of their attention. Most of its windows were dark, and all the decisions they make when no one is watching about what they're willing to carry and what they're going to put down. Her father had seen it in her when she was 11 years old, standing in front of his false wall. She had taken a long time to see it in herself. She dipped her pen and went back to the map. Outside, whispering falls kept falling. She was still listening.